Now, Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, has been in power for 35 years, longer than most people there have been alive. Almost three-quarters of Uganda's people are actually under the age of 30. Yet Museveni has shown no signs of slowing. Unbound by a constitution removing age and term limits, he expects to rule until his death. But his main rival, Bobi Wine, who's a much younger individual, seems to be successful in uniting Uganda's youth and urban population. Under the hashtag, "We are removing a dictator," Bobi Wine is hoping to unseat the longtime president. For some analysis on the situation and what to expect from today's polls, let's bring in Chris Maroleng, who's with Good Governance Afrika and is an executive for that organization. Chris, thanks for your time. Always great chatting to you. So the situation in Uganda is quite unique in a sense that there's actually no separation between the government and the ruling party. That, at the very least, suggests that the opposition party was always going to start on a back foot.
Certainly an uneven sort of playing field characterizes the political landscape in Uganda, where, as you correctly point out, the line between the state and the governing political party of all but disappeared, creating a situation where the opposition, that is political opposition in that country, including media and others who act as dissenting voices, are not just seen as political rivals, but are really identified as enemies of the state because of this compact that has been created by President Yoweri Museveni's 35 years of rule in that country.
Yeah, and let's talk about this individual who's arguably at the center of this moment. How should we remember the past 35 years in Uganda under President Museveni? How would you describe that?
Well, what's interesting is that President Yoweri Museveni himself in 1986 came into office after taking power through what has been described as a coup in that country. And in actual fact, we haven't seen in that country a peaceful transfer of power, even predating Yoweri Museveni himself. The period during his administration from 1986 can be characterized as one where we have seen a significant development, stability in the state. We saw the ultimate defeating of what was described as an insurgent liberation or insurgent movement in that country known as the Lord's Resistance Movement that was led by Joseph Kony and others. And certainly what we have seen has been economic progress and stability. However, he has ruled with an iron fist. His administration has been described as taking autocratic means as a way of governing. And it's really been checkered by the use of violence to intimidate civil society and political opposition.
And what many people agree on now is that there's really been a narrowing of the democratic space, particularly over the past few weeks, right? Real serious allegations of gross misconduct, abuse of some opposition members, etc., internet shutdowns. Does that not question the moment that we're about to enter into today? In other words, it's got many people believing it's nothing but an exercise in futility, just going through the motions as opposed to bringing a much needed turning point for a country like Uganda.
I think I under the fundamental question since polls opened about 30 minutes ago in Kampala, Uganda, and in many other places in that country is whether they can be what can be described as a credible expression of the will of the people at the polls as they open now. Certainly because these elections, and we have opened up an election tracker at Good Governance Afrika, where we have pointed out that an analysis as a historical trend of violence in that country indicates that this election, the run-up to the election, has been marked by the highest levels of political violence in that country in the run-up to any political period. We have seen the clampdown of opposition campaigning. We've seen questions being raised about the independence of the Electoral Commission. We've also seen the governing party using the benefits of incumbency to boost their advantage at the polls. And certainly what we've also seen is a situation where the governing party, the National Resistance Movement led by Yoweri Museveni, effectively using COVID-19 restrictions as an attempt to limit the ability of the opposition to campaign in the run-up to the elections. We've seen the shutdown of social media and messaging sites where the communications regulator of Uganda basically passed a provision banning telecommunications companies from allowing internet services to be provided, which provide access to such crucial services which are being used by the opposition and others to basically mobilize. So not a good situation that augurs well for the free and fair expression of the will of the people, particularly those who support the opposition in that country.
Right. And we've also seen the United States withdraw its observer mission because 75% of observer missions there actually haven't been accredited. I wonder whether stuff like that actually means anything to those who make decisions in Uganda. I mean, do you imagine that kind of withdrawal being enough of an embarrassment to change things, for lack of a better term?
Well, it does affect the credibility of the electoral outcome in that country. However, as you clearly indicate, that the national resistance movement led by Yoweri Museveni seems to be impervious to international criticism. And certainly what we've seen is somewhat of a double standard in the international relations that Uganda has with countries like the United States, the European Union, who have been long-term donors and funding partners, particularly in the security space. It's been pointed out by the opposition that it does appear that the international community, when it comes to Uganda, speaks with a forked tongue. On the one hand, they criticize their inability to observe and monitor elections, but because of security considerations and attempts to stabilize the regional security in that country, they seem to treat Yoweri Museveni with kid gloves, unable really to criticize effectively and to ensure that governance practices in Uganda are in the interest of the people and not in the interest of this ruling elite led by President Museveni.
Yeah, and then what do we make from the very loud silence from bodies like the African Union that are meant to essentially be, at the very least, looking out for the interests of all Africans? If we can have bodies like the UN weighing in, surely the African Union too is expected to say something about what's been happening.
Certainly, one would have hoped that the African Union and other regional bodies, particularly in the run-up to the election, which saw November in that country, that is Uganda, being marred by the highest levels of political violence that we've seen in that country. We saw the arrest of Bobi Wine, opposition political activist. We saw the arrest of the leaders of other opposition movements in that country, and a crackdown and narrowing of space of opposition. But the African Union has really responded with deafening silence to this. And I think it goes to show that what is required in Africa is a regional body that does not seem to be a club of leaders really propping up their interest without looking at the interest of the people of the African continent, promoting good governance, inclusivity, and ensuring that elections like the ones that we are witnessing taking place in Uganda right now are free and fair and really show and indicate a credible expression of the will of the people. Ayanda, this is not the case. And certainly we as citizens of the African continent must begin to call upon the African Union and other regional bodies like the AU to begin holding people like President Yoweri Museveni to account.
Yeah, what's really concerning is that sadly a site like this on the continent is not new nor unique. Let me thank you for your time. Certainly appreciate your perspective on this issue. Chris Maroleng is the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. Thanks very much indeed.